The night sky hung heavy over Pennhurst Asylum, a sprawling complex of decayed brick and rusted iron nestled deep within the Pennsylvania woods. A dense fog curled around the building, masking its crumbling facade and shrouding it in a deathly silence. The paranormal intelligence unit's van rolled to a stop in front of the main entrance, its headlights barely penetrating the thick mist. The team, comprised of 4 seasoned investigators, sat in tense silence, each lost in their thoughts. Agent Marcus Kane, the team leader, adjusted his earpiece and glanced at his team. To his right sat Riley Simmons, the tech expert, nervously tapping away on his laptop as he finalized the setup for their equipment. Across from him was Claire Evans, the team's medium, her eyes closed as she whispered to herself, already reaching out to the spirits that lingered in the asylum. And finally, Dr. Owen Lawrence, the historian, flipped through a worn notebook filled with scrawled notes on the asylum's dark past. "Ready?" Marcus asked, his voice cutting through the silence. The team nodded in unison. With a deep breath, Marcus opened the van door, and the team stepped out into the cold night. The air was thick with the stench of mold and decay, and the faint sound of whispers seemed to drift on the breeze. The asylum loomed before them like a beast waiting to devour its prey. As they approached the entrance, the heavy iron gate creaked open on its own, as if inviting them in. The team exchanged uneasy glances, but Marcus pushed forward, leading them inside. The entrance hall was a vast, cavernous space, littered with debris and broken furniture. The walls were covered in peeling paint, revealing the scarred stone beneath. Riley set up the equipment, the monitors flickering to life with static as they began recording. The air was thick with tension as the team spread out, each member drawn to a different part of the asylum. Claire was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're here. They're watching us." As the team ventured deeper into the asylum, the building seemed to come alive. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the walls groaned as if straining against the weight of the secrets they held. Claire led the way, her hand outstretched as she followed an invisible trail. The air grew colder with each step, and the whispers grew louder, echoing off the walls. "They're angry," Claire murmured, her voice trembling. "They want us to leave." But leaving wasn't an option. The PIU was here on a mission, and they had a job to do. They reached the main ward, a long hallway lined with cell doors. Each door bore the marks of desperate hands clawing to escape, the paint chipped and stained with dark, rust-colored smears. Riley's equipment began to malfunction, the screens flickering wildly as the energy in the air intensified. Suddenly, one of the cell doors slammed shut with a deafening bang, the sound reverberating through the hallway. The team froze, their breaths caught in their throats. Then a low, guttural growl echoed from behind the door, a sound that sent chills down their spines. Marcus motioned for silence as they cautiously approached the door. The growl grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was inside was trying to break free. Claire stepped forward, her hand shaking as she reached for the door handle. "Wait!" Marcus hissed, but it was too late. Claire pushed the door open, and the growl ceased, replaced by an ominous silence. Inside the cell, the darkness was so thick it seemed to swallow the light from their flashlights. And then, out of the blackness, a pair of glowing eyes stared back at them. Whatever was in that cell was not human. The eyes glowed with a malevolent intensity, and the air in the cell seemed to thicken with each passing second. Claire froze, her breath catching in her throat as the creature's gaze locked onto hers. The temperature plummeted, and the walls of the cell seemed to close in, the oppressive darkness pressing down on the team. Marcus, sensing the imminent danger, lunged forward and yanked Claire back just as the creature let out a blood-curdling screech. The sound reverberated through the asylum, sending shockwaves of terror through their bodies. The creature began to move, a shadowy figure emerging from the blackness, its form twisting and writhing as if it were made of smoke and nightmares. "Back up. Everyone, back up," Marcus shouted, his voice barely cutting through the chaos. The team scrambled to retreat, their footsteps echoing off the walls as the creature slithered out of the cell, its form distorting and stretching as it moved. The eyes remained fixed on Claire, glowing with an unnatural light that seemed to pierce through the soul. Riley, his hands trembling, fumbled with the equipment strapped to his chest. He quickly pulled out an EMF reader, but the device went haywire, the needles spiking into the red as the creature approached. "It's off the charts, Marcus. This thing isn't like anything we've encountered before." As the creature drew closer, its form solidified into something vaguely humanoid, but grotesquely wrong. Its limbs were elongated, its fingers ending in sharp, claw-like points. The air around it shimmered with a sickly green hue, and the smell of decay grew stronger. Without warning, the creature lunged at Claire, its claws slicing through the air with terrifying speed. Marcus reacted instinctively, pulling Claire out of harm's way and shoving her behind him. He drew his sidearm, a custom weapon loaded with silver bullets, and fired 3 shots into the creature's chest. The bullets passed through the creature as if it were made of mist, leaving it unharmed. The creature hissed, a sound that resonated with a deep, ancient rage, and its form began to warp and twist again, becoming more monstrous with each passing second. "We need to retreat," Dr. Lawrence yelled, his voice strained with fear. "We can't fight this thing head-on." Marcus nodded, his mind racing for a plan. "Fall back to the van. We need to regroup and rethink our approach." The team turned and sprinted down the hallway, the creature's screeches following them like a death knell. As they reached the entrance hall, the fog outside seemed to thicken, trapping them in the asylum's grasp. The doors slammed shut, sealing them inside. They were trapped, with no way out. The asylum's walls seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, as if the building itself were alive and feeding off their fear. The team gathered in the entrance hall, their breaths ragged and hearts pounding. The creature was somewhere in the building, and they were now locked inside with it. "What the hell was that thing?" Riley gasped, trying to catch his breath. His eyes darted around the room, as if expecting the creature to emerge from the shadows at any moment. "A shadow man, maybe," Dr. Lawrence replied, though his voice wavered with uncertainty. "But it's more powerful than anything I've ever read about. It's like it's feeding off the asylum's history, growing stronger with each passing moment." Marcus scanned the room, his mind racing for a solution. "We need to find a way to weaken it. Riley, is there any way to use the equipment to disrupt its energy?" Riley shook his head, his face pale. "The EMF reader went off the charts, and nothing else is picking up a consistent signal. It's like this thing doesn't follow the normal rules of the paranormal." Claire, who had been silent since the encounter, finally spoke up, her voice trembling. "It's not just the creature. There are more of them, trapped in this place. Spirits twisted by the asylum's horrors. They're all connected, and they're angry." The team exchanged uneasy glances. The asylum's dark history was well documented, cruel experiments, mistreatment of patients, and countless deaths. The spirits trapped here were likely victims, their souls bound to the building by the trauma they endured. "We need to find the source," Marcus decided. "Something is anchoring these spirits here, feeding that creature's power. If we can destroy it, we might have a chance." "But how do we find it?" Claire asked, her voice filled with dread. Dr. Lawrence pulled out his notebook, flipping through the pages frantically. There were rumors of a hidden room, a place where the worst of the experiments were conducted. "If we can find it, we might be able to break the connection." Marcus nodded, determination hardening his features. "Then that's our next move. We find that room, destroy whatever's inside, and get the hell out of here. The team gathered their equipment and steeled themselves for what lay ahead. The asylum was a labyrinth of twisted corridors and hidden secrets, and the shadows seemed to grow darker with each step they took. The creature was still out there, lurking in the darkness, but they had no choice but to press on. As they delved deeper into the asylum, the walls seemed to close in around them, and the whispers of the dead grew louder. The air was thick with malice, and the team could feel the weight of countless eyes watching their every move. They were no longer just hunting a ghost. They were battling the very essence of evil that had taken root in Pennhurst Asylum. The team ventured deeper into Pennhurst Asylum, their flashlights casting narrow beams of light that barely penetrated the oppressive darkness. The walls were covered in peeling paint, the once sterile white now stained with grime and something darker, something that seemed to pulse with malevolence. The floor creaked beneath their feet, the sound echoing through the narrow corridors like a whisper from the past. Riley glanced nervously at the equipment strapped to his chest. The EMF reader was still useless, the needle spinning wildly without any discernible pattern. "This place, it's like it's alive," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus grunted in agreement, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. He could feel the asylum's presence, a thick, oppressive energy that seemed to press down on them from all sides. Every step felt like it was being watched, every breath like it was being counted. "Stay close," Marcus ordered, his voice low and steady. "Whatever we're dealing with, it knows we're here." Claire shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself as if to ward off the cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. "It feels like we're walking in circles," she said, her voice trembling. "Like the asylum is trying to keep us from finding the room." Dr. Lawrence paused, glancing at the walls around them. "The layout doesn't make sense," he murmured, his brow furrowing. "It's like the building is shifting, changing to confuse us." "Great," Riley muttered. As if this place wasn't creepy enough, now it's playing mind games. Suddenly, the corridor in front of them seemed to stretch, the walls elongating and twisting as if the asylum itself were distorting reality. The floor buckled beneath their feet, sending the team stumbling forward. The shadows around them deepened, growing thicker and more oppressive, until they could barely see a foot in front of them. "Everyone, stay together," Marcus shouted, his voice strained as he tried to keep his balance. But the floor continued to shift, the walls closing in, until they were forced into a narrow passage that twisted and turned in impossible ways. Claire's breath hitched as she realized they were no longer in the same hallway. The corridor had changed, the walls now lined with rusted metal and broken glass. The air was heavy with the stench of decay, and the whispers of the dead grew louder, filling their minds with a cacophony of voices. "It's trying to break us," Dr. Lawrence said, his voice tight with fear. "The asylum is testing us, seeing how far it can push us before we snap." Marcus clenched his fists, determination burning in his eyes. "We won't let it win," he growled. "Keep moving. We have to find that room before it tears us apart." The team pressed on, their steps slow and cautious as they navigated the twisted maze that the asylum had become. The walls seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and the shadows twisted into nightmarish shapes that reached out towards them with grasping claws. The air was thick with dread, and every breath felt like it could be their last. But they had no choice but to keep moving forward, deeper into the heart of the asylum, towards whatever darkness awaited them. The corridor led them to a set of rusted double doors, the metal corroded and flaking. They stood before it, the oppressive weight of the asylum bearing down on them, as if daring them to enter. Marcus exchanged a glance with the team, his face grim. There was no turning back. "Ready?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. Claire nodded, though her eyes were wide with fear. "As ready as we'll ever be," she whispered. With a deep breath, Marcus pushed the doors open, the hinges groaning in protest. The room beyond was pitch black, an impenetrable void that swallowed the light from their flashlights. The stench of decay was overwhelming, thick and cloying, making their stomachs churn. Riley stepped forward, holding out an EMF meter that was barely flickering. "Whatever's in here, it's not showing itself," he said, his voice trembling. "But it's here, I can feel it." As they moved deeper into the room, the darkness seemed to close in around them, suffocating and oppressive. The air was thick with whispers, disjointed voices that seemed to come from all directions at once, each one growing louder as they pressed on. "Did you hear that?" Claire whispered, her voice quivering with fear. Before anyone could answer, a sharp crack echoed through the room, and something cold and wet brushed against Marcus's face. He jerked back, his flashlight flickering as he aimed it upwards. The beam illuminated the ceiling, revealing a network of chains and hooks hanging above them, each one dripping with blood. And then the voices began to take form. Shapes began to emerge from the shadows, spectral figures that twisted and writhed as they slowly materialized. They were human, or had been, their bodies contorted in agony, their faces frozen in expressions of unspeakable horror. The figures reached out towards the team, their hands clawing at the air, their mouths open in silent screams. The room was filled with the sound of chains rattling, and the walls seemed to pulse with the malevolent energy that had taken root in the asylum. "We need to move," Marcus shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of screams and whispers. "We can't stay here." But as they turned to flee, the doors slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping them inside with the vengeful spirits. The room began to close in, the walls pressing inwards, the air growing thicker with the stench of decay and death. In the midst of the chaos, Claire felt something cold wrap around her wrist. She looked down, her breath catching in her throat as she saw a pair of spectral hands gripping her tightly, their icy touch sending a shock of terror through her body. She tried to pull away, but the grip tightened, dragging her towards the center of the room where the shadows were darkest. Her screams were lost in the cacophony as the spirits surrounded her, their eyes glowing with malevolent intent. Marcus and Riley lunged towards her, but were yanked back by invisible forces, the spectral hands dragging them away from each other. It was then that Marcus saw it, a flicker of movement in the darkest corner of the room. A figure, taller than the others, its form cloaked in shadows, but with eyes that gleamed with an unnatural light. The heart of the darkness, the source. And it was watching them. Marcus gritted his teeth, fighting against the invisible force that held him back. "We've got to destroy it," he shouted over the din. "It's controlling everything." Riley, struggling against his own captor, managed to pull out his radio. "We need backup." "Now," he shouted into it, but the static was all that answered. The shadowy figure began to advance, its form rippling and shifting as it moved, the room growing darker with each step it took. As it reached the center of the room, where Claire was being pulled into the abyss, the figure extended a hand. The darkness around it seemed to pulse, drawing in energy from the spirits that surrounded them. And then it spoke, its voice a low, guttural whisper that echoed through the room. "You are all mine." As the figure closed in, the room seemed to dissolve around them, the walls and ceiling crumbling away to reveal a vast void of darkness. The spirits, once screaming and writhing in agony, were now silent, their forms dissolving into the void, their energy absorbed by the figure that loomed over them. Claire's eyes widened with terror as the figure reached out towards her, its hand outstretched, ready to claim her. But before it could, Marcus acted, his hand grabbing hold of the figure's arm. The contact sent a shock of electricity through his body, but he held on, his mind racing with desperate thoughts. "This isn't over," he growled, his voice filled with determination. The figure paused, its eyes locking onto Marcus with an intensity that made his blood run cold. But instead of retaliating, the figure smiled, a wicked, knowing grin that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. "You cannot stop what has already begun," it whispered, its voice a haunting echo that reverberated through the void. And with that, the figure dissolved into smoke, vanishing into the darkness. The room returned to its normal state, the walls and ceiling intact, the chains and hooks gone, the spectral figures dissolved into nothing. The doors creaked open, the oppressive weight lifting, but the team was left shaken, their hearts pounding in their chests. Claire collapsed to her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps as tears streamed down her face. "It was in my head," she sobbed. "It was everywhere." Marcus knelt beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "We're going to end this," he vowed, his voice firm. "We'll find the source of this nightmare and destroy it." But as the team regrouped and prepared to continue their search, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the figure's words were more than just a threat. They were a promise. The team pressed on, the dark corridors of Pennhurst Asylum closing in around them. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind through the broken windows felt like a whispered threat. Marcus led the way, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, but it did little to dispel the oppressive atmosphere. "We're getting close," Marcus muttered, his voice tense. "I can feel it. Or it's getting close to us," Riley said, his usual bravado gone, replaced by a quiet dread that hung in the air like a noose. As they moved deeper into the asylum, the walls began to change. The once sterile, white tiles were now covered in strange symbols, scratched into the surface by what looked like claws. The symbols seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly light, and the air grew colder with each step. Dr. Lawrence stopped to examine one of the symbols, his fingers tracing the lines with a mix of curiosity and fear. "These markings, they're ancient, older than anything I've ever seen," he whispered. "They're not just symbols, they're wards, designed to trap something or someone." "Looks like they failed," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper as she hugged her arms to her chest. Suddenly, a low, rumbling sound filled the air, like the distant growl of an approaching storm. The walls around them trembled, the symbols glowing brighter as the sound grew louder, echoing through the asylum. "We need to move," Marcus said urgently, but before they could take another step, the floor beneath them buckled. The ground split open with a deafening crack, sending the team tumbling into the darkness below. They landed hard on a cold, stone floor, the impact knocking the wind out of them. Groaning, they pushed themselves up, their flashlights flickering as they illuminated their new surroundings. They were in a large, underground chamber, the walls lined with ancient, rusted pipes that leaked a foul-smelling liquid. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the floor was slick with what looked like old blood. Riley coughed, waving a hand in front of his nose. "What the hell is this place?" he muttered, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. Dr. Lawrence stared at the walls, his face pale. This is where they kept the worst of them. The ones who were too dangerous to be housed above ground. The ones who were different. Different how? Claire asked, her voice shaking. "Possessed," Dr. Lawrence whispered. "Or cursed." The asylum tried to hide them away, to bury them deep, but they were never really gone. They left something behind, something that's been festering all these years. The chamber seemed to pulse with energy, a dark, malevolent force that made their skin crawl. Shadows danced along the walls, forming shapes that were just out of sight, just beyond their understanding. "We're not alone," Marcus said, his voice tight with fear as he scanned the chamber. "We need to find a way out of here now." But as they searched for an exit, the shadows began to move, coalescing into twisted, grotesque forms. The air grew heavy with the scent of rot, and the temperature plummeted, their breath visible in the freezing air. Suddenly, the shadows lunged, their forms solidifying into nightmarish creatures with gaping maws and eyes that glowed with a sickly green light. The team scrambled to defend themselves, but the creatures were fast, too fast, their claws slashing through the air with deadly precision. Riley let out a scream as one of the creatures latched onto his arm, its teeth sinking into his flesh with a sickening crunch. He thrashed wildly, trying to shake it off, but the creature held on, its grip tightening. Marcus and Claire rushed to help, but the shadows swarmed them, dragging them down into the darkness. The chamber filled with the sounds of their struggle, the air thick with the scent of blood and fear. Just as it seemed they would be overwhelmed, a blinding light filled the chamber, the creatures shrieking as they were burned away by the intense glow. The light intensified, forcing them to shield their eyes, and when it finally faded, the creatures were gone. The chamber was silent, the only sound their ragged breathing as they lay on the cold stone floor, battered and bleeding but alive. "We need to keep moving," Marcus said, his voice shaky as he pulled himself to his feet. "Whatever that was, it's not over." The others nodded, too shaken to speak, and they began to search for a way out of the chamber, the weight of the darkness pressing down on them with every step. The team found a narrow passage leading out of the chamber, a tunnel that twisted and turned, its walls lined with rusted metal and broken pipes. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the floor was slick with old blood that had pooled in the cracks. As they moved deeper into the tunnel, they began to hear faint whispers, disjointed voices that seemed to come from all around them. The voices were unintelligible, but they carried a sense of urgency, a warning that sent chills down their spines. "Do you hear that?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "It's the voices of the dead," Dr. Lawrence replied, his face pale. "They're trying to tell us something, to warn us of the danger we're walking into." Marcus tightened his grip on his flashlight, his knuckles white. "We need to stay focused. Whatever's waiting for us, we can't let it break us." But the voices grew louder as they pressed on, filling the tunnel with a cacophony of screams and cries. The walls seemed to close in around them, the tunnel narrowing until they could barely move. Riley stumbled, his hand brushing against the wall, and he let out a strangled cry as a vision flashed before his eyes. He saw the asylum as it had been decades ago, filled with the screams of the tortured and the damned. He saw the patients, their eyes hollow and empty, their bodies twisted and broken by the horrors inflicted upon them. He saw the doctors, their faces cruel and twisted as they conducted their experiments, their laughter echoing through the halls as they pushed their patients to the brink of madness. Riley shook his head, trying to dispel the vision, but it clung to him, the memories of the asylum's dark past seeping into his mind. He could feel the madness that had consumed the patients, the despair that had driven them to the brink. "We need to get out of here," he gasped, his voice tight with fear. "This place, it's alive. It's feeding off our fear." The others looked at him, their faces etched with fear and uncertainty. They had all felt it, the asylum's malevolent presence, the darkness that had taken root in its very foundations. "We're not just dealing with spirits," Dr. Lawrence said, his voice grim. "This place is a conduit, a gateway to something far darker. If we don't stop it, it will consume us all." Marcus nodded, his jaw set in determination. "Then we end this, once and for all. No more running, no more hiding. We take the fight to whatever's behind this." But as they continued down the tunnel, the darkness pressed in closer, the voices growing louder, more insistent. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, the walls warping and twisting, the floor sloping downward into an abyss. The team pushed forward, driven by a mix of fear and determination, but they knew that whatever awaited them at the end of the tunnel would be their greatest challenge yet. And as they reached the end, they found themselves standing before a massive, iron door, its surface covered in the same ancient symbols that had lined the walls of the asylum. The door pulsed with energy, a dark, malevolent force that radiated from its surface. The voices of the dead grew louder, their screams echoing through the tunnel, but the team knew they had no choice. Marcus reached out, his hand trembling as he grasped the handle. "This is it," he said, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. "We end this, here and now." With a deep breath, he pulled the door open, revealing the darkness that lay beyond. The moment the book left Riley's hands, time seemed to distort. The air thickened, every breath laborious as the ancient tome tumbled toward the ground in slow motion. The room, once pulsing with dark energy, became eerily silent. The shadowed creature screeched in anger, its tendrils flailing, but the flare's light held it at bay, keeping it from devouring them. Suddenly, a soft, haunting melody began to fill the air, emanating from the walls, the floors, the very stones of the asylum. The sound was a lullaby, sung in a language no one recognized but felt instinctively, a song of despair and death. The walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm, and for a brief moment, the team members saw flickering images of the asylum's tragic past. Ghostly figures of nurses and patients, all victims of the unspeakable horrors within these walls, appeared and disappeared, their lips moving in silent pleas. The book hit the ground with a dull thud, the sound breaking the lullaby's spell. The shadows recoiled further, the creature's form flickering as if struggling to maintain its shape. "Do you hear that?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's the children who are here." Riley nodded, his mind racing. "The lullaby, it's their way of telling us something. But what?" As the team struggled to interpret the meaning of the song, the creature suddenly lunged forward, its form solidifying with a terrifying finality. This time, the shadows didn't stop. They enveloped the team, each member feeling the icy grip of despair tighten around their hearts. But then, out of the corner of his eye, Marcus noticed something. The specter of a young girl, standing just beyond the reach of the shadows. Her eyes were wide and filled with sadness, her mouth moving as she sang the lullaby. In her hands, she clutched a small, worn doll. "It's her," Marcus gasped. "The one who started it all." Dr. Lawrence, struggling against the creature's grip, realized it too. "The child. She's the key. We need to follow her lead." As if hearing their thoughts, the girl began to move, her spectral form leading them toward a hidden door in the wall. With the last of their strength, the team followed, pushing the door open just as the creature's tendrils closed in on them. The door led to a small, secret chamber, its walls lined with ancient inscriptions. In the center was a simple stone pedestal, upon which rested an object covered in dust and cobwebs. It was an old, cracked music box. The girl's ghost appeared next to the music box, her tiny hands resting on the lid. She looked at the team, her eyes pleading, as she continued to sing the lullaby. "The music box," Dr. Lawrence said, understanding dawning on him. It was hers. This is where it all started. With trembling hands, Marcus reached out and opened the music box. The lullaby that played was identical to the one the ghostly child had been singing, but this time, the melody was filled with a sense of peace rather than dread. As the music filled the chamber, the shadows outside began to dissipate. The creature let out one final, anguished scream before it exploded into a cloud of darkness, which evaporated into nothingness. The girl's ghost smiled at them, her form slowly fading away as the curse was lifted. "Thank you," her voice whispered, barely audible over the soft music. "I'm free." And with that, she was gone. The team stood in silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over them. The nightmare was finally over, but the cost had been high. As they made their way back through the asylum, the oppressive atmosphere was gone. The ghosts of the past had been put to rest. But as they reached the exit, Marcus turned back one last time, a shiver running down his spine. For just a moment, he thought he heard the faint echo of a lullaby drifting through the halls, a reminder that the past was never truly gone, only waiting to be remembered.